Hello and welcome to Humanities 1900 Intro to Film for OCC winter semester of 2020. This is lecture video number 4 on genre. We've already established what genre looks like, what it does, how it functions, how it develops over time, and a little bit about how you can tell something fits into a particular genre by looking at its conventions and its iconography. Now, one of the important points about genre is that it's not set in stone and that it changes over time. Now, the only way that this really works is through genre experimentation and different forms of genre experimentation. Genre changes over time because audiences demand and expect change. We want our movies to do new and innovative and interesting things. We get bored if they don't. And directors are constantly wanting to try out new ideas. So once we get this experimentation, hybrids, parodies, pastiche, intertexts, then you get these changes in genres where over time, the conventions and iconographies start to morph, right, into something new. And we can still recognizably say, this is a horror film, this is a romantic comedy, this is science fiction, but we know that the genre itself has changed over time. So, for example, if you watch a horror film from the 1940s, right, the horror films that I had on last week's schedule, for example, horror films from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, versus a horror film from the last maybe 20 years, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and up to this year too, you're going to get kind of very different ideas of what a horror film looks like. The sort of traditional horror film or horror comedy, right, versus what a more kind of standard modern version looks like. And the reason why we can look at both of those things, the version from the 1950s and the version from the 2000s, and say, yes, these are both horror comedies, or yes, these are both slasher films, is because we know that those genres do shift over time. The conventions in iconography don't stay the same. But for the 1950s, this was definitely a horror film. This fits into that category. For the 2000s, this is definitely a horror film and fits into that category, while understanding that that experimentation is what allows those conventions and iconographies to shift over time. Now, it's important to think about why genres change. Why doesn't the horror genre stay the same forever? Why does a horror film now look significantly different than a horror film from the 1930s or 1940s? Now, there's lots of different reasons. Like I said, to attract new audiences and surprise old or familiar audiences. If you watch horror movies a lot, you're probably going to get bored with them at a certain point. You're going to want horror films that do something new or exciting or innovative, because otherwise they all start to kind of feel the same and blend together. So not only to make older familiar audiences happy by giving them something new and exciting, but to attract new audiences. Oh, you thought you didn't like horror films, but this isn't a horror film. This is a whole new thing. This is totally different, right? It's kind of a marketing gimmick to say, you know, it's unlike any horror movie you've ever seen before. That kind of evolution, that experimentation attracts new people and keeps the old people happy with what they're seeing. Doesn't always work, quite often backfires, but that's the goal at least, right? Also, to meet shifting societal expectations, horror movies change because the things that we're afraid of change. I can't even imagine what horror films are going to look like post-COVID-19. The thing that's most scary to us now is different than the thing that was most scary to us 6 months ago, because the world has changed, right? If you look at horror movies before and after 9/11, you can see that. You can see different types of societal fears play into how horror movies work, right? So if society's expectations and beliefs and thought processes shift over time, obviously films are going to change too. Now, also, genres change because they want to incorporate new technologies. When sound was developed in film, when color was first developed, CinemaScope, widescreen, motion capture, green screen, CGI, every time the film industry develops something new, genres change because they realize they can do something new within that genre, right? So when you have sound in horror film, because there are some silent horror films. It's a totally different experience than the pre-sound kind of silent era horror films. Once you add color, you can do certain things. Once you add widescreen, you can do certain things. Motion capture. There are all of these things that become possible once the technology becomes available to us. So genres change to kind of allow for these new technologies to be used. Also, you get new people working in film all the time. Directors, writers, producers, actors, all sorts of new blood coming into the system and kind of shaking things up. So example, Ari Aster is the director of Hereditary and Midsummer, and is relatively young, new director. These were his first two films. And I'd say, even though I will admit I'm not a huge fan of Hereditary, I haven't seen Midsummer yet, so no word yet on that one. I would say that this new director has already had a pretty significant impact on horror film and on what people kind of expect and like about horror films, and it's kind of really rejuvenated the genre. Whether I like it or not, people have responded to it, you know, quite positively. So you have like a new director or a new writer comes in, and it can totally shake up what people expect and what people want out of horror films. And any other number of reasons. Genres change over time because people change over time. We want new things. We want to make new types of art. So of course, the way that we kind of create and categorize films is going to shift. Now, these shifts also relate back to that idea of the genre cycle that I talked about earlier, where, you know, you might have a 10 or 15-year span where Westerns are really, really popular, and then they fall out of popularity. Then you get a little burst where they come back for a brief period of time, but then they go back out of style. Genres change over time because they need to, right? To create that cycle, to become popular again, they need to change. Usually that downswing in popularity is a result of kind of things becoming static or kind of stale, or people being less interested in that type of thing. How do you get people interested again? How do you loop back up to that upswing? You change, you evolve. Now, one way that you can experiment with a genre is through hybridity. Now, this is where you take themes, conventions, and iconography from multiple genres and you blend them together to create something new. So you take two things that previously exist and you put them together. Chocolate, peanut butter, Reese's cup, right? World's greatest invention. So when you take two things that people already like, you combine them together, you get a hybrid genre, and you're going to maybe draw in new audiences. So maybe this particular audience doesn't like horror films, but they like to laugh, so maybe they'll like a horror comedy. Well, you know, maybe this person would never go see a comedy in the theaters, but they like horror movies, so yeah, they'll go out and watch What We Do in the Shadows. So horror comedy is one example. You got Evil Dead, Shaun of the Dead, Tucker and Dale versus Evil, Young Frankenstein, Rocky Horror Picture Show, lots and lots of examples of horror comedies, films that blend elements from horror films and elements from comedy films into one thing, horror comedy. Science fiction horror is another example. Typically a horror film with really kind of strong science fiction undertones, or a science fiction film that scares the crap out of you, right? Sci-fi horror, Alien, Annihilation, Cloverfield, Predator, The X-Files. They're science fiction, but they're also quite scary, so horror sci-fi. Romantic comedy, those are two separate genres. Rom-com, we usually think of those as so kind of tied together that you forget that, you know, comedies without kind of romantic subplots are still a thing, and romantic films without a comedic subplot are also still a thing. Romantic comedies are incredibly common though. The Big Sick, Bridget Jones's Diary, When Harry Met Sally, Love Actually, lots and lots of examples. You could just scroll through Netflix and find hundreds of them very, very easily. But that's a particular type of hybrid genre. Take romance, you take comedy, you fuse it into one thing, you call it a rom-com, right? Or you take romance, comedy, and zombies, and you make a rom-com, which is one of my favorite subgenres. Modernization, this is another way to experiment with a genre. This is to take something that previously exists, adapt it, and specifically make it modern, change it so that it's taking place in a kind of more modern setting or a different setting. So the science fiction film Forbidden Planet is an adaptation of Shakespeare. 10 Things I Hate About You is an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. Apocalypse Now is based on a book called Heart of Darkness. Invasion of the Body Snatchers has been remade several times. There was a version in the 50s, a version in the 70s, a version in the 2000s, and a version in the 90s, right? So by remaking and modernizing the characters, modernizing the settings, taking something and changing the setting and characters to make it different, right? 10 Things I Hate About You is Shakespeare, but it's Shakespeare in a high school in Seattle in the 90s. Modernizing, updating, changing the setting, changing the characters. That's one way you can experiment. Take an old story and make it new. Now, two other ways to experiment with genre that are related to each other: pastiche and parody. Now, pastiche and parody are very closely related, but they are distinct from each other. There's a reason why there's two terms here, not just one. Now, pastiche is a work of art that imitates the style of another artist or a work that came before it. Usually this imitation is out of admiration. It's not mocking it or making fun of it. It's copying it because it likes it. Pastiche is often described, though, as empty because it references something, but it's not necessarily critical of that thing, right? It's not meant as a critique or a way to kind of speak about that particular thing. It's just using it as sort of almost like an Easter egg. One way to think about pastiche is like Easter eggs. It's there because it's cute and fun, but it's not there for any kind of serious critical reason. So a lot of people think that the films of Quentin Tarantino are pastiche because he references lots of other films: kung fu films, crime films, nonlinear films, action films. So he's making reference to lots of different little things without necessarily being super critical of any of those things, just kind of using them as almost Easter eggs, right? Like, oh, this thing reminds me of something from a Bruce Lee movie. Oh, this thing reminds me of Seven Samurai, right? So pastiche is when you reference a work of art that comes before, especially if you're making lots of little different references, right? If it's kind of a pastiche, meaning kind of like all of these different things sort of thrown together like in a stew, right? Now, parody is related to this, but it's different from pastiche because it's intentionally satirical or ironic. It imitates the work of another style, an artist, or something that came before it, but it exaggerates those tropes in an effort to make it look kind of ridiculous. Now, parody also usually comes from a place of admiration. Most of the times, a parody will show you how much the director loves the thing that they're parodying, because it's hard to make fun of something unless you're very familiar with it, right? So Young Frankenstein is a parody of Frankenstein. It's not necessarily making fun of Frankenstein, it's just exaggerating the ideas in Frankenstein to make us laugh, right? The mad scientist is even madder and crazier in this one than he was in the last one because it's a parody, right? The bumbling, silly sidekick is even more silly and even more bumbling. Parody is an exaggeration. Pastiche is a blending together of different references, not necessarily in any critical way, just like Easter eggs. Parody is satirical and ironic and kind of making fun of something, but usually in a kind of pat on the back, we all get along and like each other type way. It's a way for movies to roast each other, basically. Now, intertextuality is obviously related to both parody and pastiche. They're both forms of intertextuality. I talked about intertextuality when we did narrative a couple weeks ago, so I'm not going to get too in depth, but just to remind you, intertextuality is a relationship between two or more texts that influences how we read them. Now, film is inherently intertextual, just how it works on a base level is intertextual. So if a film is an adaptation of a novel or a comic or a video game, that's an intertextual reference. If a film includes a particular song or a set or a prop or a costume from another film, that's an intertextual reference. Now, intertextual references tell us quite a lot about genre, because when you're using intertextual references, usually you are using intertextual references that are appropriate for that particular genre. So Young Frankenstein, for example, uses props and set decor from the original film Universal's Frankenstein from the 1930s that it is making fun of, right? So that intertextual reference tells you what to expect. Before a single character speaks, you know based on the setting and the props and the costumes, oh, this is meant to look like a 1930s Universal horror film or monster movie. So intertextuality is important in terms of genre because those intertextual references can tell you a lot about what type of film you're looking at. And they're also a form of experimentation because when you start kind of referencing and cross-referencing and referencing these other kind of texts within a text, you get this sort of layers of meaning and metatextuality that allow you to sort of think about the film as part of a larger genre, right? So a film like Young Frankenstein only really works because it's part of a larger genre, and it leads to our sort of understanding of that genre through these intertextual references. Now, stages of genre, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 here, are primitive slash early, classical slash traditional, experimental, parodic, and hybrid. Now, primitive and early stage of the genre is when the genre is first starting, it's first kind of getting its name and being recognized as a genre. And the conventions in iconography are starting to develop very, very early on. So in horror comedy, Haunted Spooks from 1920, one of the first ever primitive horror comedies that kind of set the stage and set the rules for everyone else. Classical traditional, this is where the genre grows in popularity and the conventions and the iconography become more solidified. They become more standardized. So rather than just a couple small examples of this film type here and there, you get a bigger body of examples, which means that the conventions and iconography are more standard. So an example of a classical horror comedy would be The Old Dark House from 1932. Experimental is where your themes start to become more complex, but the conventions and iconography are still mostly retained. So most of the rules are still being followed, but the themes start to become more kind of layered and unusual, right? So something like Scream in the 1990s. Parodic, which also kind of relates back to experimental. These are both different forms of experimentation. Conventions in iconography are exaggerated to mock the original themes of the genre, like Young Frankenstein in 1974. We just talked about parody. And hybrid is where you get kind of a blending, modification, or extension of conventions in iconography, creating new categories. So something like the Rocky Horror Picture Show is a comedy, horror musical, right? It's taking 3 or 4 different things and science fiction, it's very science fiction-y too. You get like 3 or 4 different things kind of melded together into this kind of hybrid experiment, right? So you start with kind of like laying the groundwork, setting the rules, developing them so that everyone kind of understands them. Then you kind of start to tweak them a little bit, but you mostly keep them intact. Then you know what the rules are, so you can totally make fun of them. And then you can start kind of combining everything in these weird ways. But I don't want to give the impression that it's A, B, C, D, E, right? That it follows a linear structure, because the stages do not always occur chronologically. Of course, yeah, primitive is the first one, right? But the other stages can kind of happen concurrently. They can cycle around each other, and 2 or 3 stages might be happening at the same time. So you might get experiments and parodies and hybrids all kind of happening within the same sort of decade, right? So you start with the primitive and the classic, you move on to experimentation, but it's really kind of a cycle. And even when you start to get horror films or horror comedies that are experimental, occasionally you might just get a film that very much fits into the classical paradigm. So even once people start to experiment and create parodies and hybrids, that doesn't mean that those classical films can't be made anymore. Every once in a while, you'll see someone make a film where it's like, oh, this is just like the horror films I grew up with in the 80s. It totally reminds me of that, right? So the stages are kind of circular and cyclical, right? And a lot of them happen concurrently. So another thing to remember here is that depending on the genre, sometimes that experimentation starts very, very early on. Sometimes a film genre is barely established before people start kind of toying with it. The first science fiction horror parody was released in 1925. It's a short film called Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride, based on Jekyll and Hyde. So horror films had only existed for maybe 15 or 20 years, if that, before people started to kind of experiment with them, parody them, hybridize them, do weird things with them. So in some genres, they don't exist that long before people start saying, hey, what can we do with this to make it different? So horror comedy has existed for almost 100 years now, believe it or not, right? So that's kind of an introduction to genre experimentation. The important thing to remember here is that genres do not stay the same over time. Directors, audiences, filmmakers want to experiment, they want to see and create new things. So you start to meld different genres together. You start to modernize or update. You might use pastiche, intertextual references, create parodies to experiment with this particular type of storytelling. Now, once you know what the rules are, your first kind of impulse is going to be to break them. That's true in filmmaking, just like it is in anything else. So I would encourage you, the next time that you watch a horror film, a horror comedy for this week, that you think about the way that that particular film is breaking the rules, the way it takes those conventions and reflects on them. How does it update? How does it modernize? How does it question? How does it hybridize or otherwise kind of mess with our idea of what a horror comedy is supposed to be? So the next time you watch a film in a particular genre, I want you to think about what rules does it follow? What rules does it break? And that's going to give you a really strong sense of how genre works for that particular type of film. All right, so that's it for this week. I will make sure that you have all of your updates needed on D12. Of course, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to email me at any time, and I hope to see some of you guys in conferences. All right.